A digital extortion note demanding an untraceable cryptocurrency ransom did not arrive in the hands of. We are forced to ask why a predator would choose to alert the entire world to the sophisticated nature of the breach. Suggests the suspects wore gloves and potentially full body coverings to avoid leaving any biological breadcrumbs. The investigation then moved to the digital logs of the home itself. FBI technicians began a deep dive into the network traffic of the residents during the hours leading up to the breach. They were looking for a digital handshake. Did a device ping the home Wi-Fi? Did a cell phone connect to a nearby tower at 2 in the morning? The complexity of the Catalina Foothills geography made this incredibly difficult. The cell sectors in the canyons are notoriously large and overlapping, which means a single ping could represent a vehicle on a highway 3 miles away or a predator standing in the backyard. The team had to filter through millions of lines of metadata to find a single anomaly. Meanwhile, the crypto ransom note was being analyzed by the most elite blockchain forensic units in the country. Their demands, before the victim had even been missing for 48 hours. They were attempting to trace the origin of the wallet addresses and find a link to a centralized exchange where a real name might be attached. However, the suspects were using advanced mixing services to tumble the digital coins, making the trail almost impossible to follow in real time. The investigation was moving in a dozen different directions at once, but the primary goal remained the same. They had to find her before her heart gave out. The pressure was mounting as the 48-hour window closed and the 40,000 tips continued to pour in like a relentless tide. Each tip had to be logged. Each tip had to be checked. And each tip was another minute stolen from the search for the victim. The investigation was not just fighting a kidnapper. It was fighting a tidal wave of noise that seemed almost intentionally designed to keep the truth buried. The authorities were operating with every resource at their disposal, but they were still staring at a void. Was it a mistake born of arrogance, or was it a calculated strike designed to trigger a specific chain reaction within the federal justice system? The desert was quiet and the blockchain was cold. The crushing weight of the 40,000 tips began to paralyze the very agency designed to solve this crisis. As the FBI Cyber Division struggled to maintain its footing, the investigation entered a grueling period of stagnation where every lead seemed to dissolve into digital vapor. The sheer volume of the data provided by the public was not a gift, but a weapon. Analysts were forced to spend hundreds of collective hours verifying reports of sightings in states as far away as Maine or Florida, only to find they were looking at elderly women who shared a passing resemblance to the victim. This massive diversion of human capital meant that the elite agents capable of tracking complex encryption were instead tethered to phones, listening to rambling theories from amateur sleuths. The lawyer Michael Hupy's decision to offer a massive 6-figure reward had inadvertently created a gold rush of misinformation. People were no longer calling because they had seen something suspicious. They were calling because they wanted to be the one to claim the prize. Welcome to Ellis Evidence Room, where we strip away the speculation to examine the hard forensic data left behind at the world's most complex crime scenes. This created a profound sense of desperation within the command post. The medical window for the victim was effectively closed. Without her specific heart medication, The survival of an 84-year-old woman in a high-stress abduction scenario became statistically improbable. Yet, the ransom demands continued to surface periodically through various media portals, never once making direct contact with the family. The profilers at the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime began to notice a disturbing pattern in the timing of these notes. They were released precisely when the media attention began to dip, suggesting the captors were monitoring the news cycle with the precision of a public relations firm. If you believe in the power of evidence to cut through the noise of a chaotic investigation, please take a moment to subscribe to Ellis Evidence Room. Your support allows us to continue diving deep into the forensic files that the mainstream media often overlooks. The investigation felt like it was moving through deep water, heavy and slow, while the alleged perpetrators remained light and fast in the digital shadows. The FBI attempted to go on the offensive by leaking controlled fragments of information to see if it would trigger a specific response from the suspects. If you are dedicated to uncovering the truth through evidence and cold facts, make sure to hit the subscribe. But the wall of encryption remained unyielding. The digital trail of the cryptocurrency had been tumbled through so many international mixing services that it became a global game of hide and seek with no end in sight. The local sheriff admitted in a candid press briefing that they were effectively blind, waiting for a single mistake that might never come. They had processed over 20 terabytes of cellular data from the Catalina Foothills, looking for any device that exhibited predatory movement patterns, but the sheer density of the noise from 40,000 tips kept the investigators perpetually reactive. The tension within the family reached a breaking point as the realization dawned that they were not just fighting a kidnapper, but a sophisticated system of distraction. Every time a special agent thought they had found a viable lead in a specific tip, it was debunked within hours, leading back to a dead end. The predators had managed to turn the entire population of the United States into an accidental accomplice by triggering a mass hysteria that clogged the official channels of justice. Button and join our growing community of forensic analysts as we peel back the layers of this digital mystery. The desert sun continued to rise and set over the empty house, which was now a silent monument to a disappearance that seemed to have no physical limits. The authorities were left to wonder if the victim was even still in the state of Arizona, or if the entire ransom demand was a global distraction meant to hide a much darker and more local reality. The case was rotting from the inside out, consumed by the very information meant to save it. The breakthrough did not come from a hero's tip or a sudden confession, but from a cold, mathematical realization deep within the FBI's data analysis unit. As the team reviewed the sheer chaos of the 40,000 incoming tips, a senior analyst noticed a recurring anomaly that had been dismissed as mere background noise. While the vast majority of the public was reporting sightings or theories based on media reports, a small cluster of anonymous tips scattered across several days contained specific details about the internal layout of the house that had never been released to the public. To understand the hunter, we must first understand the environment of the prey and why these were not sightings of the victim. They were subtle, seemingly irrelevant observations about the rear entry point and the specific type of pry tool used to breach the door. When the cyber team traced the origin of these specific tips, they didn't lead to concerned citizens. They led back to the same encrypted proxy servers used to send the original ransom notes to the media. This was the ultimate peak of the investigation, the realization that the captors were the ones sending the tips. The 40,000 tips were not a random byproduct of public interest. They were a deliberate, high-level tactic known as a human distribution of service attack. By flooding the FBI with thousands of plausible but ultimately false reports, the perpetrators had effectively jammed the investigative frequency. They used the $100,000 reward as a lure to ensure the public would contribute to the noise, knowing that the sheer volume of data would make it impossible for special agents to find the real needles in the haystack. The ransom note sent to the media was the ignition switch for this diversion. Specific house in the Catalina Foothills was chosen as the epicenter of a global digital manhunt. The perpetrators understood that Savannah Guthrie's fame would guarantee a media firestorm, and they used that firestorm as a smokescreen to cover their physical movements. The peak revelation explained the peak one mystery of why the captors ignored the family. They didn't want a quick exchange. They wanted an extended period of investigative paralysis. This level of psychological and tactical sophistication moved the case into an entirely new category of criminal enterprise. It wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a stress test of the American legal system's ability to handle massive data manipulation. The digital trail was a map to nowhere because it was designed to be a map to nowhere. Every blockchain address and every proxy server was a breadcrumb leading to a cliff. The most terrifying aspect of this revelation was that the truth was likely buried somewhere in that initial flood of data, intentionally hidden by the very people who committed the crime. They had weaponized the public's desire to help, turning the community's collective effort into a shield for their escape. The vulnerability was not in the locks on the doors, but in the very identity of the person sleeping inside. The investigation was not stalled by a lack of information, but by an excess of it, precisely engineered to keep the victim invisible. As this reality set in, the focus of the task force shifted from the desert floor to the server rooms as they began the agonizing process of refiltering every single one of those 40,000 tips, looking for the fingerprints of the captors hidden within the flood. They were no longer looking for Nancy. They were looking for the architect of the noise. If you are finding this breakdown of forensic strategy helpful, please like the video and share your thoughts in the comments on how modern technology is changing the face of criminal investigations. The peak of the case was the moment they realized the hunt was being managed by the hunters themselves. The resolution of the Nancy Guthrie case remains a haunting testament to the limits of modern forensic science when faced with a truly organized adversary. To this day, the 84-year-old mother of one of America's most recognizable journalists has not been found. The massive command center in the Catalina Foothills has long since been packed away. Living a life of extreme digital silence can often be the most effective way to disappear in the 21st. And the yellow crime scene tape that once cordoned off her secluded estate has faded and torn under the harsh Arizona sun. The legal system has been forced to move into a quiet, persistent state of observation rather than active pursuit. Because no body has ever been recovered and no physical trace of her has surfaced since that cold January night, The case is officially classified as an active, ongoing investigation with no definitive resolution. The 40,000 tips have been archived into a massive federal database, a digital graveyard of false hopes and intentional deceptions. The specialized FBI Cyber Division continues to monitor the blockchain addresses mentioned in the original ransom notes, but the digital coins remain motionless, locked in a series of encrypted wallets that may never be opened. The suspects have seemingly vanished into the ether, leaving behind no DNA, no fingerprints, and no clear path of egress. For the Guthrie family, the resolution is a lack of resolution. The terrified family was instead broadcast directly to local news stations across the city of Tucson. Century. And for the 84-year-old resident of this sprawling estate, anonymity was a deliberate choice. They are forced to live in a permanent state of mourning without a grave to visit. The $100,000 reward offered by Michael Hupy through Crime Stoppers remains unclaimed, sitting in a bank account as a standing offer for a truth that refuses to surface. The primary question that remains unanswered, and perhaps the most chilling of all, is whether the perpetrators were ever actually in the desert at all, or if the physical extraction was merely a subcontracted task for a mastermind operating from the other side of the globe. Was Nancy taken for money, or was she taken to prove that in the age of information, the most powerful weapon is the ability to make the truth disappear? The local sheriff still receives calls occasionally, but the frequency has dropped from thousands a day to perhaps one or two a month. Each time the phone rings, there is a flicker of hope that the algorithm has finally found the anomaly, that one of those 40,000 tips will finally reveal its true origin. She maintained almost no social media presence, and her footprint on the public internet was, but for now, the house in the Catalina Foothills remains empty, a stark reminder that even the most fortified lives can be erased by someone who knows how to manipulate the signals. To truly understand the legacy of this investigation, we must look at the psychological mechanics of what occurred through a clinical lens. The Guthrie case provides a masterclass in the evolution of the ransom plot, demonstrating a shift from the physical to the psychological. What this case teaches us about the evolution of ransom is that the modern perpetrator no longer fears the police. They fear being ignored. By bypassing the family and going straight to the news media, the captors utilized a tactic known as media weaponization. They understood that the public's thirst for true crime narratives and the instant nature of social media would create a self-sustaining cycle of misinformation. This is a critical by hoc factly for law enforcement. In the future, the primary challenge of a high-profile kidnapping will not be the lack of clues, but the intentional drowning of the truth in a sea of crowd-sourced noise, virtually non-existent, which should have made her an invisible target in a world obsessed with data. From a criminology perspective, this represents the birth of the proxy kidnapping, where the physical perpetrator and the intellectual mastermind are separated by layers of digital insulation. We must move toward an analytical model that prioritizes data hygiene and the rapid identification of bot-like patterns in tip reporting. If the system is not prepared to filter out intentional human interference, the search for the victim will always be secondary to the management of the chaos. The safety of a high-profile individual is no longer just a matter of physical bodyguards. It is a matter of digital perimeter defense. This case is a warning to every family with public visibility. Your greatest risk is not the person outside your door, but the person who understands how to turn your neighbors, your fans, and your legal system against you by flooding the gates with 40,000 lies. The silence that now defines the Nancy Guthrie case is perhaps more eloquent than any ransom note. It is a silence that speaks to a new era of crime, where the goal is not to escape the law, but to overwhelm it. As we close this chapter of the Ellis Evidence Room, we are left with the image of a house that stands perfectly still, its secrets locked away behind a pryed door that leads to nowhere. However, this profound personal privacy sat in direct opposition to a single, unchangeable fact that she could not erase through settings or firewalls. The case of the 40,000 tips is a reminder that in the world of true crime, the most dangerous weapon is not a gun or a knife, but a keyboard and a deep understanding of human psychology. We will continue to monitor the files and wait for the day that a single line of code finally breaks the silence. Thank you for being part of our evidence-based community. If you are ready to see how a single audio file can dismantle a decade of lies, you won't want to miss our next investigation into a case where the victim's last words were hidden in plain sight. Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss the moment the next piece of evidence is finally revealed. We will see you in the evidence room for the next briefing. She was the mother of a prominent national news anchor, Savannah Guthrie. This biological connection acted as a high-value beacon for anyone looking to bridge the gap between an offline target and an online fortune. The tension in this case is rooted in that specific anomaly. While she lived a quiet and unassuming life in the shadows of the Arizona mountains, her name was tethered to a world of immense wealth and public influence. This made her what security experts call an offline target with online leverage. This cold, tactical maneuver bypassed every traditional protocol for a kidnapping negotiation and instantly transformed a private tragedy into a high-stakes public spectacle. The house itself was a fortress of isolation. The Catalina Foothills are defined by their deep canyons and massive residential lots where neighbors are separated by hundreds of yards of rugged desert terrain. In this environment, your closest neighbor cannot hear a window breaking or a struggle on your front porch. The architectural design of the area favors seclusion over community surveillance, which creates a tactical playground for a patient observer. We need to know this because it explains how a perpetrator could spend hours or even days watching the property without a single person in the neighborhood raising a suspicion. The lack of streetlights and the heavy desert brush provided a natural cloak of invisibility for anyone approaching on foot. But the unease deepens when you realize that the very walls meant to protect her were actually providing the perfect cover for her extraction. The desert night is silent, and in the Catalina Foothills, that silence is absolute. It is the kind of quiet that feels peaceful to a resident, but feels like a tactical advantage to a predator. When a victim is 84 years old and has vanished from a fortified residence in the middle of every routine she established, from the time she turned off her kitchen lights to the specific moment she armed her security system, was likely being logged and timed by someone sitting in the darkness, just beyond the property line. The fortress was not a sanctuary. It was a fishbowl. By the time she returned home on that final Saturday night, the snare had already been set and the digital trail was already being laid in a location thousands of miles away. The routine of her life was so predictable that her absence was felt with the weight of a physical blow. When the 31st of January 2026 arrived, there was no indication that the natural order of her world was about to be obliterated. She returned to her home at 9:50 in the evening, and the heavy garage door closed with a mechanical finality that should have signaled the start of a restful night. Her Range Rover was parked in its usual spot, and the house was sealed. The night, the silence is usually the most terrifying factor, but in this case, the noise was far worse. But when the next morning arrived, the absence of a simple digital login for her weekly church service acted as the first tripwire. An 84-year-old woman who relies on a strictly timed regimen of heart medication does not simply decide to ignore her health or her faith without a significant reason. When family members finally entered the residence, they found a scene that defied conventional logic. Her car was still there. Her purse containing her identification was sitting on the counter. Most importantly, her life-saving medications remained untouched in their containers. These are the items of survival, and their presence in the house meant that she had been removed from the premises with nothing but the clothes on her back. There were no signs of a ransacked interior or a jewelry box being emptied. This was not a burglary. As investigators moved through the house, they began to find the physical evidence of a struggle near the entry points. The alleged captors were not looking for a quiet exchange in a dark alleyway behind a grocery store. The Pima County Sheriff Department confirmed that the rear door had been pried open with significant force. The incident was no longer a disappearance. It was a violent breach of a private sanctuary. The question of who would do this began to shift from a local suspect to something much larger and more terrifying. How did they know she would be alone, and how did they navigate the complex security of the foothills so effortlessly? The silence of the house was not an accident. It was the result of a precise professional intervention. The family was left standing in a kitchen that looked perfectly normal, while their mother had been erased from the map. The absolute void of information in those first few hours was the catalyst for a panic that would soon reach the highest levels of the federal government. Every second she spent without her heart medication was a second closer to a medical catastrophe, and the people who took her clearly did not care about her survival. They were looking for the global spotlight, and they were using a sophisticated blockchain-based ledger to secure their payday. They cared about the leverage she represented. The investigation was barely 6 hours old when the first true peak of the crisis hit with the force of a digital explosion. A message arrived not at the house and not on the phones of the grieving family, but in the general inbox of the local news media. The revelation was staggering. The alleged captors had issued a ransom demand that was entirely decoupled from the physical world. They demanded a massive payment in cryptocurrency to be delivered to a series of rotating blockchain addresses. This move was a calculated slap in the face to traditional law enforcement. By taking the demand to the press, the perpetrators ensured that the story would go viral instantly, which put immense pressure on the authorities to act, while simultaneously making it impossible for the FBI to negotiate in secret. The reveal of a crypto ransom changed the entire profile of the suspected perpetrators. We are no longer looking for a desperate local criminal. The message sent to KOLD TV and other media outlets was clear, clinical, and devoid of any human empathy. We are looking for a sophisticated cell of individuals who understand the nuances of digital anonymity and international money laundering. They had effectively kidnapped a human being in the physical world and moved the entire negotiation into a digital ghost realm where badges and search warrants have no power. The ransom note did not offer a phone number or a meeting place. It offered a public key. The sheer audacity of this reveal left investigators paralyzed for a moment. They had an 84-year-old woman missing in the desert and a digital demand sitting on a newsroom server. The link between the two was a violent pry mark on a back door and a total lack of a physical trail. This was the first major peak of the case, and it left one terrifying question unanswered. How do you find a victim when the only people who know where she is are hiding behind unbreakable encryption? The reveal was complete, but the explanation was non-existent. It signaled that the individuals responsible for this extraction were operating with a level of digital literacy that completely outpaced standard local law enforcement capabilities. The authorities were standing on the front porch of a crime scene while the suspects were already miles ahead in a digital landscape that has no borders and no rules. The mobilize of the FBI Cyber Division was immediate and total as they attempted to bridge the gap between the desert sand and the digital cloud. Over 40,000 individual tips began to flood into the FBI systems within the first 48 hours after the news of the ransom went public. This was an unprecedented volume of data for a single kidnapping case. The flood was partially triggered by a $100,000 reward offered by an independent lawyer, Michael Hupy, through the Crime Stoppers program. The intention was to incentivize the public to provide that one missing piece of evidence, but the result was a catastrophic overload of the investigative infrastructure. Every special agent in the region was suddenly tasked with sorting through thousands of dead ends, fabricated stories, and delusional theories from around the globe. While the cyber team was drowning in data, the physical evidence response team was conducting an inch-by-inch sweep of the Catalina Foothills property. They found microscopic traces of the struggle, but no usable DNA that matched any known criminal database.